So it seems that we caught the coronavirus here, and it moved through our community. And here we experienced it as a mild cold. Moved through our community more or less like a cold. Our symptoms were similar to a slight flu on average. Some people didn't seem to have any symptoms. Most people had slight, and a few had more severe, like an ordinary flu. And so we can be very grateful for that. We're grateful that we had a couple dozen people get it, and we didn't experience any significant problems. And now we're clear, which feels great. Some people who I've mentioned this to have said, well, you were very lucky. And perhaps it's that we were lucky. Perhaps that's the case. But I have been trained in economics and in Buddhism, and in both cases we tend to frown on the explanation luck. It's seen as a mere lack of an explanation, especially when you have a relatively good sample size. So 20-some people is a pretty good sample size to be still depending on something like luck for an explanation. And so I'd suggest that while it's possible that it was mere luck, it's possible that we're favored by God, and other similar explanations are possible. I can't say that those are not the explanations. I would want to search a bit harder. And when I search a bit harder, what I find is this. We eat well every day. Everyone here eats well every day. This is extremely unusual in the world. We get exercise every day. Everyone here gets exercise every day. That's extremely unusual in the world. We interact with friends every day. Everyone here interacts with friends every day. This is extremely unusual in the world. And these three things are very good for one's immune system. Very good. And I find it sad that in an attempt to, in the short term, respond to the crisis of the coronavirus, we've taken steps to make it harder for people to do all three of these things. It's sad. A short-term solution with long-term negative consequences. It's hard to know what to do under these circumstances. It's very difficult to know how to handle this. It's confusing. It's disorienting. And so we respond in a typical human fashion with concerns about the very short term and the very local. Our myopia in space and time is unfortunately consistent for our species. And so I feel very proud that we here took steps a long time ago. How long ago? Well, you could say a few years ago, or you could say a few millennia ago. But in any case, we took steps in this system to ensure that we would be well positioned to respond to the coronavirus crisis. I feel good about that. We made sure that we were healthy emotionally, psychologically, physically, and even spiritually. This circumstance right now is quite concerning. It's dangerous in many ways, but it's also an opportunity. It's encouraging in many ways. It's dangerous, of course, in that we have caused poor health, poor relational health, poor physical health for many people. It's difficult for us to interact with each other, and that's sad. If we want to interact with each other, then most of us have to do so through the filter of multinational corporations that offer video conferencing technologies. We want to get exercise. Well, that's actually very difficult nowadays. We're even making it difficult for people to go outside into parks because of concerns that people either might walk past someone too close or that someone might turn an ankle and stress the medical system. We see in this dangerous time the continuing encroachment of large systems taking control of our lives. I'm not a historian, but if we look back through history, then we see that there are a number of power structures in the world, and for a long time, the main power structure was what you might call the church, so religious institutions. They were at the center of everything that we did in society, and competed, you could say, for power with two other large-scale systems, one being government or the state, and the other being companies or the market. These three systems of control have struggled and cooperated over the years regarding power. And if we look back in European history, which of course is just one small part of world history, although sometimes that's hard for some of us to remember. But if we look back into, let's just say for now, European history, we see that up until 13th, 14th, maybe 15th centuries, the church was the main power structure, the Catholic Church in particular, and held enormous control over social systems and was involved in almost everything. It's actually hard for us nowadays to understand how completely it was involved in people's lives. It was involved in birth and death and everything in between, marriage, contracts, the postal system in terms of writing, and certainly in terms of telling people how to look at the world, how to understand the world, how to make meaning of one's life. And of course, history is complicated, but right now we're looking at a pandemic with great attention. The world is looking at this with great focus. And so let's talk about that a little bit. something happened that contributed to the breaking of the church's power in Europe, and one very powerful influence was the Black Death, the plague. It killed something like a third of the population there, and did so very quickly. In just a few years, it came in waves, but it was still very, very quick. And everyone who came out of that, you could say, just since we're looking at that part of the world, all the white people who survived it were traumatized by it. In some places, 80–90% of the population was killed, and there was no one to bury the dead. There was no explanation for what was happening. And people wanted an explanation for what was happening. And the church failed to give it. And one of the reasons it failed to give it was that so much of the church, so many of the priests, for example, died. But priests were needed for everything that was happening in that society. And so they ordained young people, didn't train them very well, and put them directly into power. And they did a bad job. They didn't have true faith. They certainly hadn't developed any understanding of, well, any deep understanding of the doctrine, weren't in positions to lead, and didn't have a deep spiritual understanding. And so they didn't do a good job. And when we nowadays think about the church, we often think about this stage of the church, because this was the end of the church as they knew it for over 1,000 years. So the explanation about what was happening was not at all clear. And what I would say the explanation was, if I could go back and be ordained as a priest and tell people what was happening, well, then I would tell them, well, it's very simple. God is telling you, stop breeding so much, and stop traveling so much, and stop trading so much. God is telling you to slow down, stop this frenetic pace of your society, and return to a simpler mind. That is what God is telling you. It's true. If there wasn't so much trade, and there wasn't so many people, and you weren't continuing on in this way, well, then this plague wouldn't have happened. And this is true. If you go back even further, if you go much further back, then for the vast majority of human existence, there weren't pandemics like this at all. Because hunter-gatherer societies, nomadic societies, small bands couldn't have problems like this. So the way we live here, we're a small band, you could say, and something like the coronavirus sweeps through and is gone. And then if we weren't interacting with other people, then it would just go extinct. If it had any way to evolve at all, it would just go extinct right away. It would go through us, and then after a few weeks, it would be gone, just as it is here now. But then we started living in larger and larger communities. And so pandemics like this could move through until you come to something like the cold, which just keeps on changing, and we, due to our lifestyle, allow it to survive. But for a long time, there wasn't any such thing. And then we came together, and then society became more complex. And then eventually we came to a certain point in Eurasia several hundred years ago when things such as the Black Death could succeed due to the population density, travel, trade, and such. And so nature or God or whatever you call it is saying, hey people, stop it. That's our message to you. But we didn't want that message. And if I was a priest back then, I don't think I would have been a very successful one, because people don't want that message. They didn't want it then, and we don't want it now. Despite the fact that I would say that this virus is saying exactly the same thing again. No, humans, you are not the center of everything. You're not. It's your job to slow down, calm down, and simplify your minds. The purpose of life isn't the acquisition of human control over all things. That is not what this is about. So stop it. Well, we didn't want that message. And the church, in fact, didn't succeed at giving us much of a message at all. And so other forces gained dominance. The church broke up with Protestantism, and then a collaboration of the state and companies produced colonialism and capitalism as we understand those things now. And that was a very complex and sophisticated cooperation between these other two styles of power, the state and the market. They made a new structure together rather than the church working with primarily the state. The church, for example, could give authority to rulers. But that cooperation fell apart, and a new kind of cooperation was further developed, although it wasn't invented at this time by any means, but it was further developed, and we accelerated into the modern world. And we see at this time of significant danger that this system, that I can't imagine anyone or any group of people is in charge of, this system, this collective intelligence, this machine, continues to take advantage of each next opportunity to gain, to consolidate control. And if there's any single danger that I would want to point out the most in terms of our mundane activities, it's that it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen, but we can feel confident that in about a year, the vast majority of the developed world will have become accustomed to living in a totalitarian state. Because that's how we're living now. We're living under house arrest. Our locations are being tracked. We have completely surrendered control of our lives to the state. Even here in Vermont, if you go out in Burlington without good reason, then you're fined. Businesses that don't go along with the orders are fined even more. And there are plenty of parts of the world in which you're imprisoned for going outside. So we're living under house arrest, and the way that we attempt to connect with each other can no longer be what our Constitution refers to as freedom of peaceful assembly. So we can't assemble anymore. It's not allowed. And we're becoming accustomed to this new world in which we can't assemble. It's very difficult to collaborate in order to change anything or challenge the powers that be. And in fact, the way that we can communicate with each other is through video conference, the phone, or various companies that make it possible to see each other and hear each other remotely. And I find it fascinating that people there is the sense that if you're not going along with these systems, then you are selfish and unpatriotic. It's your job to go along with this. And people get mad at each other. There's enormous social pressure to keep people in line at this time. Enormous social pressure. And so we go onto these video conference systems and we offer our innermost thoughts and emotions to these companies for free, knowing that they're going to take that information, they're going to use their algorithms to analyze our words, our tone of voice, our facial expressions, in order to better manipulate us as parts of an economic system. And we offer this, the most precious aspect of our lives, for free. Here are my thoughts, my emotions, my desires that I'm sharing with my friends, and it is yours to take, analyze, and use for your economic gain. And again, there's the statement that if you don't do this, you're not patriotic, and in fact, you're selfish. And so more and more, we enter into this totalitarian world. And I have to say that this is just fascinating, because most people, what's most amazing about it to me, is that most people don't seem worried about it. Most people just take it. Well, this is how the world is. The world just is like this. There's nothing to be done. There's no other way to handle it. Because if you don't go along with it, then you're killing people. That's what's happening. If you don't go along with this, then you might infect someone who might infect someone who might die. And that's more dangerous. I know it's very controversial, but from the beginning of this epidemic, I suggested that we here get the virus as soon as possible, make sure that we all got it and got it over with. And why? Well, because that way we would flatten the curve, as they say, because we would get it before the high part of the curve, and we would also shorten the curve. Most people now are recommending that we flatten the curve by lengthening the curve, so that we maximize this current situation's length. We want it to last as long as possible by decreasing death during part of it. I feel very glad that we ended up getting it unintentionally early on, finished with it, and have confirmed, at least in our community, that health, at least in my opinion, of course you can say it's luck, but that health, connection, exercise, nature, are actually of benefit to us, even in a crisis like this. So the question arises, why? Why is it that we're willing to put ourselves into this situation? Why is that? Now, there are lots of explanations, of course, and they might be right. We might say, well, we're worried about people dying. We don't want people to die. But to be blunt, I don't believe that explanation. Because if we really cared about whether people died, then we would be more worried about other things, like car accidents. Plenty of people are social distancing, self-isolating regarding this virus, but they still have a car and drive around. And more people have died of car accidents than could ever die of the coronavirus, even if we did nothing. So if people were really worried about killing, this unintentional kill, you might drive and that might kill someone. If people were really worried about that, then their actions would represent that. So why is it that we're behaving in this irrational way? Why are we so concerned about this one? Other ones, such as pollution, I believe it's still the case, it was the case for quite a while, that more people's lives had been saved by the decreased pollution than had been killed by the coronavirus. I believe that's still true. So there's lower pollution because the economy has slowed down so much. So many fewer people have died, especially the youngest and the oldest. And lives have been saved. Well, if we actually cared about lives saved, then we would have shut down the society years ago, decades ago, in order to save those millions of lives who have died of various pollutants, not even including carbon dioxide. But let's talk about carbon. Why not? If we actually cared about people's lives, then we would trust the scientists, as we have trust scientists in this case. And we would say, let's shut down the entire economy, at least to the extent that we already have, in order to be sure that global warming doesn't kill billions of people. But we haven't done that. No one, to my knowledge, has suggested that in any major forum. I don't hear any politicians saying that in their debates. One politician says, you know, what we should do is put everyone under house arrest, make all of the businesses shut down except for the ones providing essential services, and go into a worldwide economic depression in order to prevent global warming. I haven't heard anyone say that. But we did say that regarding this, despite the fact that this is threatening far fewer people. So why? Why do we care so much more about this virus than we do about life on Earth?